Dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to warmly welcome you all to our today's webinar about research perspectives on due diligence. My name is Ursula Kopp. I'm part of the team of the Institute for Managing Sustainability at the Vienna University of Economics and Business, and I'm your facilitator for today. We have invited 3 top researchers working in 3 different European countries, who I will introduce in a minute. But let me first hand over to Professor Andrea Martinuzzi, the head of our institute and the coordinator of the Diligence project.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you come from. Welcome to our 4th webinar in the European project Diligence. I will take the next 3 minutes to briefly introduce you to this project because I think it's of high importance for you as you've chosen to attend today. You seem to be interested in due diligence. When we talk about due diligence in the Diligence project, we focus on mineral value chains and we talk about human rights in environmental due diligence. The project started about a year ago, and one of the major milestones and the first long-lasting legacy of this project is a one-stop shop, a virtual platform that offers information for beginners as well as deep dives for professionals. It addresses basically companies, so it serves companies with a purpose to help them to navigate among several regulations, standards, and digital tools. In the beginning, we thought, okay, digital tools, there must be something out there. Well, we found more than 100, and now we understand the big confusion of companies that try to take more responsibility but don't know which tool to select, which standard to apply, or even are not aware of the regulation that's valid in certain countries, in their certain value chains. It will provide quite soon an easy to self-check for the beginners, for the newcomers, and we will then develop next year targeted learning materials that perfectly fit your needs. Part of this is a navigator for, as I said, standards, tools, and regulations. Self-check tool I already mentioned. We will also show pathways how to involve people affected, so workers or neighbors or affected communities, into diligence assurance mechanisms. There are first results already at hand. We will start a tool testing procedure, and we also would like to run with tool developers workshops to support their tool maturity. Basically, these tools are very different. You will see that when you visit our website. Some are very easy, very for newbies, some are very sophisticated, and would like to support tool developers increasing their technical and their methodological maturity. And we also work on due diligence practices in companies. Basically, we've done a state-of-the-art analysis, how companies implement due diligence, so then analyzed gaps. Now we will do a series of interviews to assess also the needs of companies, and then we will publish pathways for improving the effectiveness. The Diligence project is implemented by a European consortium of different organizations. My organization is VU, the Vienna University of Economics and Business. It's a large business school situated in Vienna. We collaborate with EIT Raw Materials. You probably know World Resource Forum. You probably know, I'm quite sure you know WWF. For sure you know KPMG. Perhaps you know BRGM, Solidaridad and Avima. And Levin Source is a boutique consultancy in the UK, and Static is a software company in Belgium that helped us to develop and to implement our one-stop shop. Short recap, what happened in the last month. We already implemented 3 of these webinars. We had about roughly 100 participants in each webinar by now, and I see now we reached 98. So if 2 more attend, we can say 100, and if 3 more attend, we will see with 300 plus. Yes, we are here, 100. That's not a fake. That's not any colleague that's joining. Now, again, a webinar with more than 100 participants. It just shows that you're highly interested in the topic, as I am, and I'm more than happy that we can welcome our 3 distinguished speakers today. Uschi, back to you.
Let me now please welcome Professor Miriam Wilhelm from the Vienna University of Economics and Business, Professor Stefan Seuring from the University of Kassel in Germany, Professor Andreas Rasche from the Copenhagen Business School. Thank you so much for coming and for taking the time for this webinar. May I first give the floor to Professor Miriam Wilhelm. She's Professor of Sustainable Supply Chain Management here at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. And she started her professional career, at an international automobile manufacturer. So now she's capable and she can combine a very practical view with her academic research. We're looking forward to your speech.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to kick off the webinar with the first talk, and the title of my talk is Mandatory Due Diligence, a Paradigm Change for the Governance of Sustainability in Supply Chains. Before I talk about the paradigm change, I want to start with describing what the current model looks like. So the current model is characterized as a compliance-based approach. It is based on the articulation of formal standards. These are formalized requirements that a multinational company or a buying firm is passing on to their suppliers. So standards regarding environmental and social conduct, and that the buying firm would like the supplier to follow. Compliance with these standards is monitored through audits. These audits take place every 3 to 5 years. And then as a final step, there is a remediation process, meaning that non-compliances are resolved and then audited again. And ideally, we would have a linking of sourcing decisions of the buying firm with the level of compliance of the supplier. So the overall objective of this approach is to detect supplier non-compliances. But this approach has also been described as top-down, and I think you can kind of see the top-down character of this approach by, yes, the standards are formalized and by one party and then passed down, as I said. So there's a cascading of requirements upstream in the supply chain. This model has also been criticized as not being very effective. So there are a lot of empirical studies on this that have shown that over a time period of the past 10, 20 years that we've been following this model, there have been actually very little improvements of suppliers regarding compliance with environmental and social standards. So what we see instead is relapses between audit cycles or supplier fatigue, or basically also just suppliers hiding, or of course trying to hide their non-compliances. So limited progress, and what we see instead is a shifting of responsibilities upstream in the supply chain. And the kind of risk perspective that is propagated through this model can be considered or can be called an outside-in perspective, because companies mainly see sustainability transgressions in their supply chain. They perceive it mainly as a risk to their own reputation. That's why we call it an outside-in, so threats to the company itself. So yeah, moving on to the new model. This is a new model that is promoted by the mandatory due diligence legislations. And this model is trying to actively depart from these previous models of a compliance-based approach and move toward a risk-based approach. And I want to explain to you what that means. So first of all, due diligence is a process of identifying, preventing, mitigating and accounting for adverse impacts. So there's a cycle that is depicted here of different process steps that firms need to follow in order to identify and detect these risks and to address them before they materialize as harm to people and planet. So the overall objective is to prevent harm, not just to enforce compliance, but to prevent harm. And the approach is much better characterized as being bottom up rather than top down. Because we want to also engage, and I will talk about that in a couple of minutes, we want to also engage potentially affected stakeholders in the process. So it is much more shifting the emphasis on prioritizing risks. So that means that companies do not necessarily need to monitor their whole extended supply chain. They don't need to know what each and every supplier in the chain is doing in all these different countries. But they need to prioritize actions where they can expect the greatest impacts in the supply chain. So this is what a risk-based approach means. So what is important to mention is that due diligence is an obligation of conduct rather than obligation of result. And to put it maybe in a simpler language, this means that companies are not being punished for the existence or presence of child labor in their supply chains, but they are punished for the failure to detect it when they could have detected it. So it's companies are asked to follow this process of due diligence obligations to the best of their ability. So this is what an obligation of conduct means. The risk perspective that is propagated here can be contrasted with the previous one that I've shown you as an inside-out risk. So it is really about firms' harm, firms' impact on people and planet. Okay, so yeah, I would like to move on to the next slide. So the effectiveness of this approach is still unclear, and that's because we don't have data yet. These legislations are quite new, so there's very little empirical evidence, to no empirical evidence actually. So we don't really understand, of course, what the actual impact will be. And I think a related problem is that the body of knowledge, and I'm talking about academic literature here on sustainable supply chain risks, even though that literature is quite developed, so there's a lot of literature out there, but it has been developed irrespective of due diligence. So I think we do have a rich body of knowledge, but it didn't really align, or it doesn't really align with the due diligence process as is depicted here. So there is a study that I conducted with Charlotte Both and that we just published, and we invite you to read, of course, the paper. But in this study, we are mapping the existing body of knowledge on supply chain sustainability risks with the due diligence process to identify where the current knowledge gaps are. And as you can see here in this picture, risk identification and risk assessment. So this literature corresponds to the first stage of the due diligence process. Then we have risk response, mitigation, avoidance, and then risk monitoring. So we were mapping this literature with the due diligence process. And yeah, I don't want to go into the details of the papers, but I want to focus in my last slide on some open questions and future research avenues that we have clustered along 3 topics. And the first topic is risk analysis. And so one question where we think we need more research is, what does the emergence of a risk assessment market mean for the rigor of risk assessment and responsibility attribution? So what we're observing now is there is a market of technology service providers, and it's quite a crowded market, actually, quite a lot of startups popping up that are all offering their services to companies on how to assess sustainability risks in their supply chain and thereby also fulfill due diligence obligations. I should mention here that I think the assessment of sustainability risk in a supply chain is quite a novel challenge for most companies, and existing risk assessment tools for assessing traditional supply chain risks are not readily applicable here. I think the problem about a lot of these technology service providers is that they all operate with different methodologies that are more or less transparent. They operate with different data sources. Sometimes they have very fine-grained data on a supplier level that is also validated. But sometimes they also operate with very abstract risk indicators on a country level. Sometimes it's a mix of these two. Sometimes you also throw AI into the mix. But yeah, the methodologies are very, very different. And thus we don't really understand how rigorous is the risk assessment really. And of course that impacts the success of the due diligence or the result of the due diligence process. The second question we want to ask is, how can we develop bottom-up, stakeholder-led supply chain sustainability risk identification mechanisms? As you've seen, they're quite central in the due diligence process. At the same time, it's again something that companies have so far very little experience yet. However, a risk is a harm that hasn't materialized yet, which means that we want to detect these risks very, very early. So we need to identify these risks on the ground, and that's why we also need to incorporate stakeholders in our risk assessment. I think that's also kind of a new requirement of the due diligence process. Moving on to the next topic, this is about rights holder, and that's related to the last point that I just mentioned. So we want to integrate rights holders and stakeholders, not just for the ability to detect risks early, but also, of course, to have an honest dialogue with them and to be able to remediate their concerns. Again, what we're seeing here is a market developing for remediation mechanisms, for whistleblower platforms. And yeah, you can ask a similar question here. How effective are these mechanisms really? And how does it then impact the outcome of the due diligence process? And it is very, very difficult to design effective remediation mechanisms for marginalized communities, but it's even more difficult, we would claim, to do that for nature, because the planet is also a stakeholder, but it doesn't have a formal representative. So another question we're asking is, how can we incorporate the voice of nature and natural science knowledge into the due diligence process? Then the final block of questions is on the effects of the due diligence legislation. And that's, of course, a question that everybody's interested in, right? How effective, how successful will it be? But yeah, there are a couple of questions I think that are connected to this last topic. So first of all, who's paying? So how can we distribute the costs and benefits of due diligence in the compliance-based approach? These costs have so far mostly been outsourced or delegated to suppliers. And even though the due diligence legislation mainly targets large corporations, their suppliers will most likely incur additional cost in terms of additional reporting requirements, or, that is even more costly, adaptation to their production process. So who's paying for these additional costs? Another question we would like to ask is, how can firms practice responsible disengagement strategies? I think there's very, very little research on responsible supplier disengagement. This is, by the way, seen as a last resort in the due diligence legislation. So this is the ultimate last step, but sometimes we need to disengage from non-compliant suppliers or irresponsible suppliers, but we need to do it in a responsible manner. Another question we need to discuss is, what are the unintended effects of risk response strategies? And with this, we also explicitly want to include the cost of inaction, because I think we often forget that inaction actually also incurs costs. So we need to talk about these costs. And also we want to emphasize that unintended effects can be both negative and positive. And I think so far, at least in the media and the public narrative, the negative effects of the due diligence legislation have often been emphasized a lot, whereas the positive effects that it can have, for example, for improving supply chain resilience, have not so much been talked about. And then the last point I want to raise is, so how do we measure the effectiveness of due diligence, the due diligence process? This means we have to move from a purely activity-based to an impact-based indicators. So rather than just verifying whether a specific measure is in place, so for example, how many trainings are conducted at a supplier per year, or how many grievances are reported. This is what the compliance-based approach does. We need to look much more into the process, the quality of the process. So how are trainings actually conducted in practice, and how have grievances been resolved? And yeah, with this, I thank you very much for your attention. Yeah, this is the final slide. So ultimately, what due diligence wants, or what the legislation wants, is that we move from this outside-in risk, so the business risk perspective, to a reversal, so to a societal perspective. Yeah, so thinking more, or getting firms to think more about the risk they pose for people and planet, and how they could mitigate these risks. Thank you very much.
Thank you for starting this. And I would like to move over to our next speaker, Professor Stefan Seuring. He's professor at the University of Kassel, and he has been head of the supply chain management department for more than 10 years. He's a pioneer in the field of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research on sustainable supply chains. The floor is yours. Thanks for taking the time.
Many thanks, Ursula. Then let us directly move into the slides in the next one. This is basically a bit of a personal recap on what happened in my career. And you see, we look back at 2008, and it basically directly relates to what Miriam just introduced very nicely. So we see that there is the dominating perspective of companies still taking a risk approach. Yeah, and once more, I'm saying it's a historic perspective because we pointed to this already in 2008. And also in the logic of looking at minimum standards that have to be kept by on the environmental and social side. Let us rather move to where I tried to complement what Miriam introduced by looking at some recent empirical studies that we did. And the first one is on the next slide, please. So this is a small interview-based study. You see it's only a couple of pages, and it's almost recapturing many of the arguments that we have had in the sustainable supply chain field a lot. What are the opportunities? What are the risks? You see that we have here typically issues, awareness and relevance of sustainability, typically issues still for companies, the business frame conditions in the competition, which they always argue for. And as said, it rather complements and takes a bit more moderate perspective what companies do. On the risk side, it's also not too much a surprise. The market-based risks, financial risks, administrative, legal risks, all mentioned. And turning the perspective, as Miriam nicely framed this, to the application of conduct is, I would say, it against what we saw here, basically still not available. And that's really assuring and affirming what we just heard also on the research directions. Yeah, implementing issues are the last box to implement, and also the issue on what this would do on the performance side is still open. Let us move directly to the second study. This is a bit more an unusual one. In this case, we basically looked at Twitter and did what is called Twitter, or by now I guess you have to say X analytics. And interpreted this somewhat against stakeholder logic, which was also mentioned. So the conceptual framing is basically shown here. So we have the stakeholder groups affecting the process, both of the regulation as well as monitoring it afterwards. That's all relevant. We see then the typical challenges, opportunities, which links also into the slide that we just had. And then we can look at how much does this relate to, or that's partly what we did, how much does this relate to theoretical issues that we see in the sustainable supply chain arguments, and that's basically how we group this. Just on the method side, very briefly, Twitter gives you very much unstructured data, and therefore, of course, we had to interpret it in a certain manner, and that's the framing that we did. Let's look at the subsequent slide. Then we see here basically just as an example that you see what we did, a mapping of the stakeholder groups on the top on the one hand side into then challenges and opportunities on the other hand side. So we have the legal issues, the legal flaws, we have the question of bypassing responsibility, insufficient sustainability awareness, and so issues, of course, the question of competitive advantage or rather disadvantage, cost regulation. So I don't want to read all of them. On the positive side, a bit more like increased transparency, advanced traceability that is seen there, which should really be enabled by such approaches. And let me bypass a typical saying that I have discussing such things with companies. Many of the things demanded in the due diligence regulation, if you do not have them in mind at all, then you miss really out on economic risk and you do not know enough about your supply chain. Yeah. Moving to the next slide, we can now look a bit more into the synthesis and avoiding to look just on the single points. We have a comparison of the practical due diligence regulation discourse and theoretical developments. We see a research gap in how the challenges are operationalized and how can we actually handle this. This was also partly pointed to by Miriam already. What information do we have available? How do we get the information? How far can we actually look into the supply chain? Particularly if we do take a look at multiple tiers of the supply chain. We see certain suggestions in sustainable supply chain management theory, but of course it's still an open issue on how do we avoid it. We just do the minimum in assuring that we meet certain standards and do not move beyond of this. The theory here is almost a bit more positive, saying like if you really go for this, then you should identify opportunities for also business improvements that would help you. We see on the stakeholder side, we see still arguments on information asymmetry. So who's really in charge of certain things, who's also able to do some traceability, is a buyer really able to ask suppliers, second-tier suppliers, third-tier suppliers for traceability information? And is this implemented using, let's say, blockchains or something like this, where we see it in the most recent time, really also the blockchain logics being challenged a lot? Yeah. So we have, and last but not least, we still have the challenge on, is the sustainability logic is in line with financial logics, and many of the companies, and that's what you also found in the tweets, still see a problem here and rather see a trade-off solution than the typical win-wins that we hope for. Next slide, please. I'm already, I promised to make it on time. And what we see here, what's basically missing in these arguments, but highly relevant for supply chains, is how does this really work on the multi-tiers? How do we move such information to the lower tiers of the supply chain? How do we actually monitor the lower tiers of the supply chain, which are further away and where it's not so much an issue? And the second point is, if we want companies to implement this, how do we get them beyond, again, just taking this shortcut approach of I have to fulfill certain obligations, and rather trying to move to a positive outlook on I can actively manage risk, I can actively contribute to sustainability, I can actively engage with stakeholders, with the business environment to drive such sustainability issues forward. Many thanks already from my side on these short, bit more practically driven insights, and on to the next.
Thank you very, very much for this really, really short and precise input. I just saw a question in the chat that might relate to what you just said before,
Okay.
and I would like to
Yes,
put that question, if that's okay. Somebody is writing, can you share some thoughts on how this might link to frameworks for recording risks, such as adverse event logging or corrective action, preventative action?
recording the risk and knowing the risk. That's what I tried to say was the point of many companies denying the relevance of such regulation. They overlook how much risk they have in their supply chains anyway. So any approach where you get to know what your risks are would definitely be helpful, and then also being able to manage them. And in my contact with companies, I still see a lot of reluctance in really taking the supply chain serious. And if I look at many of the global issues that we have, the next barrier arguments that we just have in the press is only one of the tipping points at the moment. The issues of standstill in different industries because of deliveries for whatever reason is a typical observable issue, and that has links also into the sustainability side as much, the environmental and social as much as the economic one. So, sorry, long answer short, knowing better where your risks are and what they may be, and therefore being able to manage and not just run behind them, catching up once they occur and you don't know about them, should they basically enable companies to take a definitely more proactive approach.
Thank you very much for that. And I would now like to move over to our third speaker, Professor Andreas Rasche. Welcome. He's working at the Copenhagen Business School. He's Professor of Business in Society at the Copenhagen Business School Centre for Sustainability. He has collaborated with the UN a lot, and he's also up to date what's going on the EU level. I'm looking forward to your input.
Thank you very much indeed, Ursula. Good afternoon from Copenhagen, and it's great to see you all. Thanks for joining. I will give, in the next 10 minutes, a short update on the EU Omnibus in the context of the CSDDD. So let's move to the next slide. And let's maybe, before we go into the omnibus itself, to look a little bit into the policy context, because the simplification discussion actually is not that new. A lot of people kind of think, so that's a 2025 thing. It's actually not. I mean, I have a picture here from Ursula von der Leyen in 24. Actually, the first discussions around regulatory simplification, they date back until the end of 2023. The rationale, obviously, is cutting compliance costs, and the CSRD and the CSDDD, they are the prime target of this. However, the political process that we're seeing unfolding in Brussels and Strasbourg right now is kind of troubled by many different problems. First of all, there is insufficient justification. Also, the Commission itself did not sufficiently justify the Omnibus 1 proposal. That's why the entire issue has moved now to the EU Ombudswoman, actually, and she needs to make a decision on that. She can issue a recommendation, but no legal judgments. It is also, unfortunately, a pretty one-sided discussion. The politicians are very much focused on the costs. High costs, they believe, basically signal a lack of competitiveness. But of course, it is not a cost-benefit calculation. And the idea, that by slashing costs, you inevitably and quickly become more competitive, I think, is also a very simple one, because competitiveness itself as a construct is very multifaceted. Politically, of course, this relates back to the Draghi and Letta reports that we had seen in 24 and them calling for regulatory simplification. Next slide, please. So all of this is also geopolitical, and I think we shouldn't kind of see this as just something that comes out of Europe. Europe is trying to reposition itself currently in the global landscape. The global landscape is changing. And I put here to the left, actually, the joint statement between the US and the EU on the trade deal. And you read, and that was paragraph 12, that actually the EU committed to water down the CSDDD and the CSRD to an extent that they do not pose undue restrictions on transatlantic trade. And the Trump administration is extremely keen on that. Trump and also some other governments, Qatar, for instance, they are moving very aggressively. Qatar has directly threatened to no longer provide LNG to Europe should the due diligence directive not be further watered down. So what they basically say, what we have right now in terms of the watering down is not enough. They are afraid of lawsuits, mostly with regard to the climate transition plans and the high penalties, actually, that are attached to it. So this, I think, is important as a backdrop. It is not just Europe. You need to see it in a bigger picture, and this is what is explaining, I think, quite a bit what we're seeing. Next slide, please. Where are we right now? I'm not sure how familiar you are with the EU kind of process, the EU legislative process, and I won't go into details here. Basically, you have three positions. One of them is still under negotiation. So you have a parliament position, you have a council position for the member states, and you have the commission who makes the original proposal. I think for the CSDDD, what we will see is a very, very significant reduction in scope. The scope will be set, and this is almost certain by now, at 5,000 employees and 1.5 billion euro turnover. And this roughly leaves around 1,000 European group companies in scope. The transition plans, this still needs to be debated. There are different opinions on it, but they have been watered down significantly, particularly in the latest proposal by the European Parliament. So we need to see where this ends. It is quite interesting to actually look at the due diligence approach, because one key critique also of some member states actually was that the original proposal by the European Commission did not align the CSDDD any longer with the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines. And now the Council and actually the Parliament, they have kind of backpedaled a bit. And the new proposal is actually, it comes closer to what Miriam actually presented earlier, this kind of risk-based approach. It is not fully in line with it, and there are many issues that still remain open. But nevertheless, I think we can say a little bit of progress has been made there compared to the Commission proposal. And last but not least, of course, what politically speaking has led to the extraordinary situation that we currently see in the Parliament is the civil liability. Political forces, the Social Democrats and also some of the Liberals, they definitely want. They definitely want a stronger civil liability regime. So I think this is something that we see being negotiated. Right now, we will not have a EU-wide civil liability regime, which of course begs the question, how much teeth then does the CSDDD really have if you don't have a kind of harmonized civil liability regime? Next slide, please. So we also did quite a bit of research on the scoping. What I show here is the reduced scope of the CSDDD. roughly, as I said, 70% scope reduction, 1,300 companies remain in scope. If you just look at group companies, this will be roughly only 1,000. So this is, of course, not a lot. That's why, of course, this sends the message which we hoped would not be sent. Basically, due diligence is something only for the giant firms. This is what this implicitly sends. And politically speaking, of course, this is absolutely not a message that we want to hear at this point in time. So the CSDDD has been watered down significantly. Next slide, please. This will put up, of course, the question, what about voluntary commitments in the future? If you cannot enforce it through law, will there be voluntary commitments? I think there will, because many companies, I've also talked to companies here in Denmark, they view due diligence actually as an appropriate risk management process. Actually, Stefan was just talking about it. And that's why they will continue these voluntary commitments. But of course, voluntary action is different to mandatory action. You miss comparability, you miss benchmarking, and this, of course, is a key problem. On the reporting side, I put here, we recently published a case study in the Financial Times. Is sustainability reporting valuable if it's not compulsory? And you can ask the same question for due diligence, obviously. And I would encourage you, to discuss these things, be it in companies, be it in universities. I think this is unfortunately where the field is moving. We are moving more towards voluntary commitments again. So we need to discuss what makes companies voluntarily adopt frameworks like, for instance, the CSDDD. And then you come at different pressure points that exist. And for instance, also pressure points from banks, from investors, but also from business partners. So, and this then I think is quite interesting. Next slide, please. These kind of pressure points, I said it before, they need to be analyzed. This is something that we are working on at our center here right now. We know, for instance, also in the context of due diligence, that many business partners actually put these kind of requirements also on other companies. Many investors, particularly pension funds, in Denmark here we have big pension funds, they also kind of put this on the agenda. So I think it is too easy to just say, now we de-scoped 70% of companies and off it goes. I would say the discussion will change in the future. We will have a very different discussion on due diligence, probably leaning away from mandatory obligations towards more analyzing what is the competition doing, what are governments requesting, for instance, in tenders, what are business partners and what are investors requesting. Next slide, please. And then, of course, the obvious question, I'm asked this quite a bit these days, how do we go? What is the timeline for the EU Omnibus? What I haven't read here are the two decisions that we have. We have the Commission proposal from February. In June, the Council kind of created its position. Next week, on the 13th of November, we will see the Parliament vote on the Omnibus. And then the trilogue negotiations will follow. From what I'm hearing, actually, we can be pretty certain that the trilogue negotiations will be finalized by Christmas. So probably before Christmas, we will see at least an agreement. For this then to be a final legal text, it will still take time. And then we are talking about 2026 because these, as you know, these things need to be translated. And they then also need to be approved by Council and Parliament again. So still some time to go. Interesting times, politically speaking. A lot will depend on how parliamentarians vote next week and what coalitions can be formed. That's it from my end. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, I'm looking forward to discussing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andreas Rasche. Thanks a lot for your very short and concise overviews. I've seen a few questions here. I try to start with one of them and then we go along. And please feel free, all of you who wants to answer. But the one I just noticed concerning your last speech, Professor Rasche, is the one short question is, would we expect US, Japanese or other foreign firms to work on this as well? Or is this a very specific European debate? And maybe a second one to add to that, what should be the main driver for ecological and environmental due diligence now that the the CS-DDD change scope and timing?
Yeah, I mean, regarding the first question, the law is pretty clear on its extraterritorial effects. I mean, this is the big problem of the Trump administration. So it pretty much doesn't make a difference whether in the US or whether you're in Japan or whether you're in China. If you kind of make, or if you meet the thresholds, and if you have this amount of turnover on European markets, you will actually be in scope of the even revised CS-DDD. Of course, we will need to see how this plays out politically. As indicated, this is very, very contested. The Trump administration at the moment even is writing directly to some of the big companies, basically telling them, to not comply any longer with the CS-DDD. I've just seen a letter today, which I will also put online tomorrow, of state attorneys in the US pushing Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook in a direction which directly basically says, do not comply with this law any longer, because we do not consider it to be in line with US interests. Second question around the driver, the drivers. Well, I think the best driver always, of course, is kind of your implicit conviction that this is the right thing to do. And for some companies, of course, that works. For others, I think probably, at least from my subjective experience, without having any data on it, I think it is probably pressure by business partners that will drive these voluntary disclosures, and also pressure by banks and raters, because they have quite a bit of influence on companies and what they do, and it is often, if you, for instance, look at ESG raters, kind of one of the boxes that they tick. So I think this is what will drive the debate in the future.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We also collected some questions before the event when people applied for it, and I'm going to mix them a little bit maybe. There was one is, well, maybe a big question. Now, how can companies and policymakers ensure that mandatory due diligence frameworks lead to real improvements in supply chain practices rather than being just another compliance exercise? Anybody would like to say a bit on that? Is that Miriam? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, of course, right? So that was the question I also raised in the end. There's, I think, no magic tool on how to achieve that. I mean, as Andrea said, the best thing would be conviction. The second best thing is pressure, right? And so I think ultimately, and that's what I was trying to the message I was trying to bring across is that they need to develop a different perspective of risk. That would be my answer, right? So stop seeing sustainability transgressions mainly as harm to your own firm's reputation, but acknowledging the risks that you're posing to planet and people, and think about way how to mitigate that. So I think we need that perspective change. And then with that, I think all the tools we have right now, they're not bad tools. I think they still deserve their place, and also audits, right? I mean, social audits will also continue to play a role, but it's all about the way that these tools are being used. And I think that needs to be this perspective change first.
Mm-hmm. And there's one bigger question that would say, and why should companies continue working on this if there is no legislative process going on?
I think
Well, there are many.
Yep.
There are many pressure points, as I said before, and I think companies cannot ignore these pressure points. I mean, if you are publicly listed, investors ask questions, and I think also government tenders are increasingly kind of looking at human rights standards. So I think it is not just a question of whether this is legally prescribed or not. I think it is also a question: what is your ecosystem as a company, and in what kind of ecosystem do you operate? And this then determines the pressure that you experience.
Mm-hmm.
And just to add to this, and I bypass this, I think it's really in the mere interest of companies to know better what's going on in their supply chains. Yeah. If you talk to the supply chain managers, logistics managers, then they typically have at least a bit of a feeling. If you talk to others, then this is like board that just has to work and the pallet will be there on time. Yeah, it's still a very restricted view of the supply chain. And once more, you can look at the recent events in not only around COVID, but also around many other issues, going up to the rare earth metal issues that we have and so on. And it's affecting literally thousands of companies in the EU. And they have to do something about it. And of course, there's also the legal framework and the political framework for having access to this. And maybe as a side note, of course, we have also moved a lot of the mining out of Europe because we thought the dirty processes can be done somewhere else and we don't want to have them. We actually have some of these materials here, but we basically stopped a lot of the mining, at least in Germany, for, let's don't do the dirty stuff somebody else can do. So there's also issues even reaching into the political arena on are we willing to reopen mines in over here, just as one example.
Anybody who wants to add, Andre, to the question, why should companies still do it?
Well, I think there is one more perspective we could add. We've done a series of case studies last year and asked companies that engage beyond legal compliance, why do you do it? It's even beyond. What is your motivation? What did you exactly do? Was it successful? And what was the return? And we saw that they have different stories. One story is the story now we know better. Resilience, risk, and so on. There is this story we have to. That's a legal obligation, legal requirement thing with a counter story. Oh gosh, what a dramatic burden. With a counter story, push the button, take blockchain and AI, and it will solve everything. So these are already existing stories. But we found one more, which we found incredibly interesting, rare but interesting, to perceive supply chains as innovation ecosystems, so that they innovate along supply chain. They co-innovate. The better they know their supplier, the more they can innovate together on a higher level. And I think that's a perspective that goes clearly beyond all of these administrative burden versus regulation things to say we must perceive supply networks as innovation ecosystems.
Thank you. I've seen a few more questions here. They say to the speakers, how do you explain the increasing resistance to hard law such as CSDDD? Are there other legitimate concerns than administrative burden? Is that question clear?
Yeah, I think it's very clear actually. Are there other legitimate concerns? I mean, I think for quite a bit of companies, of course, it was about the burden, so to say, and this burden and competitiveness narrative. I think some others have also argued, of course, that all of this is without much effect. So the impact, right? And then you combine the impact with the burden, and then as a politician, then you have a very good argument because you basically argue that why do you spend the money if it doesn't have any impact? So, but I think we need to be very careful with these kind of arguments. I also recently told a Danish politician, you are simplifying a Danish European politician. You're simplifying a directive which has never been implemented. How in the world can you measure its impact, right? You cannot. The only thing that you do is you look at kind of proxies. You look, for instance, at what has happened with the German supply chain law, what has happened in Norway with the relevant legislation, what has happened in France with the relevant legislation. But this by itself shouldn't be necessarily a proxy for CSDDD. And I think that is the problem. That's the main problem with the simplification process. We are flying blind because we are simplifying regulations that we never tested in practice.
There's one more bit more concrete question here. How are you involving stakeholders and right holders from Africa and the developing world? That's a more practical one.
Yeah,
Stefan?
Yeah, I have to move a bit on beyond what we presented here. At least for my team, I can say that we have been collecting data. By now, I'm allowed to say minimum half around the globe. Yeah, and this is a typical issue. So we published recently one paper's just in press That's data from Pakistan. Another recently is data from Brazil, and more on the way and such things. Of course, that's not trivial, and it might not directly now relate to due diligence regulations, so I look at wider supply chain issues. But definitely we have to engage on multiple levels also as researchers. Now, I guess we are allowed to stay in the perspective as researchers, and collaborating with colleagues, also going for data collection into these countries is at least the minimum that we can do. It might not be the best and most forward-looking response to the question, but it's at least the minimum that I see happening not only in my team.
Thank you.
Maybe I can, sorry.
Yes,
I was
please.
still thinking about the legitimate concerns question. You know, what do companies are afraid of beyond administrative burdens? I think another thing which is very important is that so far, I mean, companies have been so used to hiding risks in their supply chain. There has been no incentive to reveal this risk. Yeah. And so I want to really emphasize that what due diligence wants to achieve is that companies actually, that reporting these risks is a good thing, so that you don't put it under the carpet because companies were afraid of these reputational effects, but that they become more proactive in really detecting this risk. So I think that's another concern that companies have, of course, that the more of these negative incidents they discover and report, that this would have negative consequences from them. So again, I think this corresponds to my point earlier that we need this mind change in how companies think about these risks.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to add? I have a couple of questions on AI. I would like to put them together and see who of you would like to relate to that. One is what role for AI-based solutions are for due diligence do you see? And how do you see the role of AI-related digital tools in facilitating sustainability due diligence work in companies? Pretty similar. And could we carefully investigate all possibilities of integrating sophisticated AI applications into due diligence system, risk assessment, productivity effect analysis, and so on and so on? What's your view on that or your experience?
Maybe
Miriam?
start with it. I'm sure that the other speakers have a view on that as well. But I think I am highly skeptical of AI. I mean, yes, there's a lot of hype about AI being able to, access big data and make predictions based on data and recognize patterns. But I think the major challenge we have always been facing with supply chains is that we have very little data on supply chains. And I think the lack of data is something that AI cannot overcome easily. So that's why I am skeptical. I do think AI might have a place in detecting inconsistencies or irregularities in what suppliers are maybe reporting. And then based on that, you have to take further actions. But I think we will still need these on the ground verification. That's why as I said earlier, I think audits will have a place. We just need to use them differently. But I do think that data still needs to be validated, and AI can't do that.
I would, if I shortly may, I would basically perfectly agree. We see that there's also tool providers trying to play with certain AI tools in providing standardized information. And my feeling is if the AI knows, then it's almost obvious. And I also see the point for in your particular supply chain. Which if the companies can always and have to manage their particular supply chain, the end customer, which is typically blamed for something, has so many supply chains that every one of us is using daily that you have no chance in overviewing all of them. But if you are producing laptops or if you're producing other electronics, then you are in the electronics supply chain, and then you will have experts on the electronic supply chains, and they will know the second and third tier companies. They will know where the materials come from and all of these kind of things, and then they can do something about it, which is far more specific than the bullet points answers that you typically get from AI tools.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Andreas?
I mean, yeah, I kind of share what has been said before. I'm also, I would say, I have a healthy skepticism towards that, mostly also because what we are discussing under the umbrella of AI these days, of course, it kind of depends quite a bit on the data that is already out there. And if the quality of the data that is out there is not that good, your results will also not be as good. I think one application where I could think AI could really help is also benchmarking. Benchmarking kind of different types of companies on different dimensions of due diligence. If the data is available, I think that could be something, because this is also done in the reporting world, where quite a lot of companies use AI for benchmarking. And kind of developing benchmarks that companies can then take as a reference point for their own practices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Just for time reasons, because we would like to stay within this 1 hour, I put 2 last questions together that I just saw. Does the pursuit of transparency and compliance paradoxically create blind spots that justify withdrawal instead of reform? And the other question is a very specific one. How does due diligence protect farmers in this context from your point of views? And what measures should be taken to ensure that they are included in the system as equal partners? Is there any experience on that?
I can start with the second one, the paradoxical one. Boy, it's a good one, but I find it very hard to answer shortly. We have worked a lot also on farmers in different parts of the world. And typically you also need to move beyond due diligence. First of all, you typically have some agents in between, sourcing agents that do the sourcing of bulk, let's say for coffee or such products, so that you then aggregate it. And the farmers always dislike the agents, but without the agents, they quite often do not have access to markets. So this is a bit of a dual role of these actors, as this has been called in the related supply chain literature. But typically you would also have to engage into rather supplier development related efforts to really help the farmers to develop, to stay in the market, to even meet competitive needs of, in some cases, international markets, in some cases also national markets. So it's a bit more a differentiated debate, which partly moves beyond the pure due diligence.
Thank you. Andreas?
Well, on the paradox, that's indeed, that's difficult to answer in like 2 minutes. But at the end of the day, of course, yes, compliance is never the answer, right? Compliance is reactive. Compliance does not move you forward. So I would not necessarily see it as a paradox. Not at least as a logical paradox, but as a tension, right? Because with compliance, you only go halfway. It becomes a tick the box exercise, and this is exactly what we don't want. So the question really is, how do you shift mindsets? And I think if we want to stay in this paradox language, if we want to kind of do something about this paradox, then probably we would need to shift our assumptions and our beliefs about how due diligence is supposed to function. And I think this is probably the more challenging task than just creating new compliance requirements. We need to go into companies and really challenge the assumptions and beliefs about compliance. And from there on, I think you get to the good stuff.
Anything else to add, or anything you would like to say at the very end of this webinar? Anything from the previous themes or questions? Or has everything been tackled? I've seen many comments in the chat. Thanks for everybody who contributed and shared some information on that. And I think, we had a very concise and interesting overview of the current research. We recorded this webinar. The slides will be available to you very soon. And so it's up to me to say once again, thank you very much for joining us and for taking the time and for sharing your expertise and experience. Thanks a lot. Just a short info, what's next. Our next webinar is taking place in December, on December 11, around noon, on assurance schemes to due diligence, how to make smart choices on that. We see companies that change to these voluntary sustainability standards and related assurance schemes, and not all of them are happy with their choices, and it's not that easy to grasp. So we've invited 3 ladies from different perspectives. They are all also partners in the diligence project, and we are looking forward to welcoming them in our next webinar to give you some more information on that. We will always keep you updated as usual. You can register for a newsletter And it's now my task to say thank you very much again and goodbye.